Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to do the very sad conclusion of my spring TBR, which was very ambitious. If you had seen the video, I had so many books that I wanted to get to, and today you're gonna learn which books I actually got to in the end. But before we do that, I will go through the month and tell you how those went. And I also want to just quickly mention, if you're not regularly watching this channel, I do have kind of 3 TBR piles that I use to do these like monthly TBRs. The first one is all the books that I owned before the beginning of the year. So I'm trying to do a 0 TBR, which so far has not been going great, but I try every year to read the books that have been on my TBR for a long time, just so I can have quite a quick turnaround and don't have my books lying around for years and years, as some of these already did. So that's the first goal. Then I always have a goal of 5 series that I want to read this year, and I try to map out the kind of quarters when I want to read each series, just so I keep on track basically. And lastly, I have 5 new to me authors where I chose one of their books and I want to read those throughout the year. So that's the source of the TBR. Now let's see how I did with it. So the first month of the second quarter is obviously April. In April we had the magical readathon, so I had the additional challenge of matching my TBR stacks with the magical readathon prompts I needed to do for my career. So I did read a lot in April. I read over 10 books, but not a lot of those were from this TBR that I presented. In fact, 30% of my reading in April were from the TBR and 8% were from the library. So overall I had 8 books on my TBR from the lists, and of those 8 I started 4 and finished 3, and then I also finished one that was carrying over from March. And then on my library TBR for April, I had 2 books, and of those I started and finished 1. Then in May we had the next readathon, and that was the Asian readathon, which I also wanted to participate in. So luckily some of my books worked for that, but not all of them. So I had again 8 books on my TBR from this selection, and of these 8, again I did start 4 and finished 3, and 1 was also a carryover from April that I finished. And then for my library TBR, I had 1 book on there left, and I did not read it in May, so no library books were read in May. So that means I read, of all the books that I read in May, 50% were from my TBR list, and 0% were from the library. Now the other books were audiobooks that I acquired new. And lastly we have June. In June I also tried to participate in a readathon. It was the Patreon readathon by Riley Marie, but then I also just tried to get to the books that were the highest priority on my TBR list. So again, I had 7 books on my June TBR from my selection. Of those 7, I started 2 and I finished 1, and then I had 1 carryover from May. And for my June library TBR, again, I had 1 book left on there and I did not read that, so 0 library books in June. Which means that in June, 40% of the books that I ended up reading were from my physical TBR and 0 from the library. So looking back at the first quarter, I think that I did a little bit better then, because the percentages were just a tiny little bit higher. So I had 55% in March and 45% in February, while I think in the second quarter I was a bit more consistent with like 30, 40 and 50%, but still never getting quite over the 50-55% mark is a bit sad. I would like to get to more books from my TBR. We'll see whether we can do that in the third quarter. But now that we've talked about the numbers, let's go and see which books I actually ended up reading and which books will remain on my TBR for the near future. Now, starting with the series I wanted to read in this quarter, I had the Dandelion Dynasty series. This is the first 3 books. We have The Grace of Kings, then we have The Wall of Storms, and The Whale Throne, which I actually all ended up reading, and this took up a lot of my reading time. And now with Speaking Bones, I made it about halfway before the quarter was over. So not quite finished this one yet, but it will be finished right now. And then for the author I wanted to try this quarter, I wanted to try Virginia Woolf, and I decided to go with Mrs. Dalloway, and I also read this one. Okay, and now let's get through all of the other books you see. I had on my TBR Sweet Bean Paste by Doreen Tsukegawa, and I did read this. Then we have Disability Visibility by Alice Wong, and I did read this. And then I had 2 books from like my TBR pile, but from different seasons basically. So I kind of switched them out because I needed those for prompts. So I have also read Only Ever Yours by Louise O'Neill, which was from originally my winter TBR. And I read Realm of Ash by Tasha Suri, which was originally on my summer TBR. So with that, I'm gonna switch out some of these books for other TBRs. But that's all. Okay, so let's talk about the books that are still on here. We have Love Saves the Day by Gwen Cooper, which I still hope I will get to one day. My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. This was not anywhere near the top of my list, so this will probably stay a little longer. This is a book I know absolutely nothing about. I just found it in a little free library. It is called Die Nacht der Könige by Stefan Boise. Then we have these kind of feminist non-fiction books. We have The Women's History of the Modern World by Rosalind Miles, and then 2 German books, Radikale Zärtlichkeit by Sheda Kurt and Die letzten Tage des Patriarchats by Margarete Stokowski. These are books where I'm just so annoyed that I haven't gotten to them yet, but I will one day read these books. Then, keeping with the non-fiction, we also have The Unwomanly Face of War by Svetlana Alexievich. And this one, it doesn't feel right now during those times that we're seeing, but one day I will read this. And then we have Lu Andreas Salome by Kerstin Decker, which is a biography about a woman, which I really want to read. It just seems that I never find the time. And then we have Tolkien's Beren and Luthien and The 120 Days of Sodom by Marquis de Sade. And for the books that I will kind of switch and sneakily put on my summer TBR instead, we have The Soul of an Octopus by Cy Montgomery and Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. Now, if I look at these 2 stacks of the books that I managed to read and the books I did not manage to read, they are about the same size. So even though I did not read half of the books, because this series is so freaking long, I still read quite a lot this month. So I'm not unhappy. Like, obviously I always want to read more and especially reduce my TBR more. But yeah, I feel like with this series, just a lot of my reading time was already kind of planned out and I didn't have a lot of like wiggle room. And then additionally with the readathons, obviously I also wanted to read books that fit. So yeah, I am okay with the results, I guess. I always wanted to be more, but you know, we all have like other things we need to do as well. So let me know how your second quarter went reading wise. I would love to hear about that, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!